On this episode, the one and the only thing that coarse sediment forebays are good for. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. Now today is one of those episodes where I'm going to share an opinion of mine with you, but this is one of those opinions where I can guarantee you there are a bunch of people out there who aren't going to agree with me. So I'm going to preface this by saying two things. One, that's totally cool, right? This is the whole purpose of making these videos, is to have discussion so we move this industry forward. And part of that is recognizing there are times when we don't all agree, and we have the discussion, because collectively that's what progresses us and that's what helps us learn. Number two, I'm going to talk about coarse sediment forebays today. I am going to criticize some current practice in some guidelines. I'm probably going to disagree with the stance in Healthy Waterways Bioretention Technical Design Guidelines. That's also totally cool, but I do want to say this. This isn't a personal criticism of anyone who wrote guidelines or anyone's particular opinion, if for no other reason than the fact that I was the producer of that document. So if it's a criticism of myself. So let's not get our knickers in a twist about this, right? Okay, so let's get into it. So what is the episode about? So here around us, behind me, behind you, being the camera, we have a combined bioretention and flood detention basin. So in this instance, this actually has two inlets. We're at one of them, the other one's behind the camera there. In this instance, we have stormwater pipe coming in over there, next to the lovely Imperator cylindrica, and that is native sarsaparilla on the top. What is its name? Hardenbergia violacea. Stormwater pipe comes in, coarse sediment forebay at the front, moderate sized bioretention part there. It's a rectangle that kind of heads away from us that way. And then flood detention, like extra area for flood detention down here. For ages, I have not been a fan of coarse sediment forebays. They've been put in for a long time. They've been in all our guidance material. It says you're building a bioretention system, you should be at least strongly thinking about or definitely putting in a coarse sediment forebay. The guidance has changed a bit over the years. Earlier guidance, so the Water Sensitive Urban Design Technical Design Guidelines for South East Queensland, WSD TDG, it effectively mandated coarse sediment forebays on all bioretention systems. The more recent update, which is the Bioretention Technical Design Guidelines, published by Healthy Waterways, only requires coarse sediment forebays in some instances, not on small sites, not from bioretention that just drains roofs and a few things like that. But it does still require them. And there's lots of people who are in favour of them, and I want to tell you why I'm not and why I think that we should be stopping building them. So, to understand that, we need to understand the history of why we started putting them in the first place. So, as it has been told to me, was that when people, so we're going back to like the early 2000s here, so first bioretention systems built in southeast Queensland in 2001, then the WSD TDG was built in 2006, so we've got a 5-year gap there. The first bioretention system in southeast Queensland does not have a coarse sediment forebay. In that period, more bioretention systems are starting to be built. People are starting to figure out what needs to be in there. It comes to writing this guideline, and there's some concerns about, well, we know that sediment comes down with stormwater. Do we really want that getting on the bioretention system surface? Might that, cause some problems? And went and talked to some maintenance people, and apparently, as it's been told to me, the discussion was, look, if sediment's a problem, we need to get rid of it. What's the easiest way for you to get rid of it? And unsurprisingly, the answer was a dedicated area at the front with access, so we can get down into it easily, dig it out, take it away. That was the logic, right? And conceptually, that logic is totally fine. Now, fast forward to today, there's still heaps of people who think coarse sediment forebays are really necessary. And you can go out to many coarse sediment forebays and see lots of coarse sediment in them, which would seem to support that, right? If we're getting lots of coarse sediment in, well, we don't want it getting in and amongst the plants where it might smother them. So let's capture it up the front. That seems supporting that. I want to break this down because I don't think coarse sediment forebays are worth it for a couple of reasons. Which way do I want to come into this? Okay, let's come into it this way. Let's firstly look at how much Actually, let's look at what a coarse sediment forebay will actually do and whether coarse sediment matters. So, the way this system is meant to work is we have the pipe come in, we have this concrete area at the base, raised wall, cutouts in the wall, so water comes in, gets slowed spread, the coarse sediment drops out in the centre there, and the water flows out through those slots. Conceptually fairly straightforward. The problem here is, let's look at what actually causes a problem for bioretention systems. What actually causes a problem, so we've got two types of sediment here. We have coarse sediment, so big grained heavy stuff that will actually sink out in a setup like this. And then we have fine grained sediment, so like suspended solids that will float, that'll stay in suspension and simply aren't going to settle out here. Let's look at what happens if each of them gets into a bioretention system. So, coarse sediment forebay, if it gets into the system, it can be spread out across the surface, it'll build up on the surface, it could smother really young plants, but because of the fact that it's coarse, it's like sand, right? When we're talking coarse sediment, we're talking like sand sorts of particles here. And so water's still going to drain through it. It is not, in my opinion, a risk of blocking up. Oh, there's a guy walking over here. I'm going to look really funny talking to a camera, as always. The risk here, actually, I'm going to bring this over and walk around with this for a minute. The risk here, no, not the risk here. So the coarse sediment comes out across the surface of the bioretention system and spreads out, could smother young plants, so there's a risk there. But what it won't do is it won't block up the surface. Because it's coarse, because it's like sand, it's freely draining. So water's going to keep draining through any coarse sediment that comes in. Then we look at fine sediment. Fine sediment does pose a risk of blocking up a system because small little particles can kind of infiltrate in the filter media, fill up all those little gaps. Clays, they can bind up, hold onto lots of water. Fine sediment definitely can block up bioretention systems. This system's draining really slowly. Maybe it's got something going on, something like that going on, maybe not. I'm not going to go into this particular system. But the point here is that so in my mind, okay, so then we've got coarse sediment. I'm stumbling a little bit. I'll apologise for that, but I'm going to do my best with this episode, and we're just going to keep it all in here. Coarse sediment, we think, could smother plants, is its problem, and fine sediment could block the filter media. Well, fine sediment then is definitely a problem. So the first question I asked with respect to the coarse sediment forebay here is, will it do anything to stop fine sediment? No, it will not. Fine sediment is not going to settle out in this system, so in that respect, it's doing nothing, right? Because let's look at what has settled out here. I've got a little bit, look at this, it's like sand. I'll get my fingers out of the way, maybe we'll focus. Yeah, some grit, it's like sand, it's not fine stuff. In fact, it's like, look how perfectly clean that is there, right? So definitely not capturing fine stuff. So this is a problem. So coarse sediment forebay is not helping with fine sediment, not helping with blocking of the system. Can it trap coarse sediment? Yes, it can. We just saw that there. But then we have to ask ourselves something. What happens next time it rains? Because we can see here, like this system's a really good example of it. What happens is water comes in, and it's kind of the low flows kind of head round in this corner. There's a little bit of settling out of coarse sediment happening here. But in any bigger flows, it seems like the sediment just gets remobilized and just blasted straight out. Because in a bigger flow, that rather than trickling around the corner there, I'm going to back up and try and show you this. So big flow trickles around the corner. You can see, small flow trickles around the corner. You can see the water there, deposits some sediment in that corner. Big flows blast out a little bit straighter towards my bike here. There's a bit of sediment that's been dropped out here, but you can clearly see this main flow path through the center there, where it just stays mobilized and just gets out of there. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, yes, coarse sediment forebays clearly can drop out sediment, but if then someone's not here really regularly cleaning that sediment out of the forebay itself, it just gets remobilized and just goes into the system when you get a big event that picks it up. So what we've got here now is our understanding is this. Coarse sediment might be a problem for smothering plants. Fine sediment is a problem for blocking up the filter media. Coarse sediment forebay does nothing for the fine sediment, can capture the coarse sediment, but you need to get in here really regularly to then clean it out of the coarse sediment forebay before a big storm comes down and blasts it all out. So, okay, not being particularly effective unless you're maintaining it regularly. Okay, fair enough. Well, what would happen if we let that sediment just go? Let that coarse sediment go into the bioretention system? Well, I did some sums a couple of years ago, and I only had a brief look at this spreadsheet before I came out to make this video. But broadly speaking, I'll spin this back around, we can have a chat this way for a while. When I did those calculations, I used the sediment loading rate of the bioretention technical design guidelines, picked a fairly typical bioretention surface area to catchment area ratio, did some estimates about how much coarse sediment comes out and how much sediment will accumulate in the system over time. And it's equivalent to like maybe 5 mils a year of coarse sediment spread out across the whole top of the system. It's not very much. But I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait, I've seen tons of coarse sediment forebays with heaps of sediment in them. Yes, you have. But I've looked into that as well. And my belief is that all those coarse sediment forebays that we see that have heaps of sediment in them are in fact sediment forebays that are holding sediment that's come off construction sites. So about a year or so ago, this particular area, the houses weren't built yet. And they were all construction sites. And there was lots of sediment coming down and into this forebay. And there was lots of sediment in it. And then we got big rainfall events. Well, then a few things happened. The houses all finished building, by and large. It's like 90% done now. Houses all finished building. We got some big storm events and it blew all of the sediment back out and over the edge and, you know, into the system. So what I'd contend to say to you is this, is in fact, coarse sediment itself in bioretention systems doesn't really matter in the amounts that we are likely to see enter the system. Because using the loading rates in the bioretention technical design guidelines, it's not very much sediment. It's only 5 mils a year. And I don't know what the and was going to be there, so I'll just keep going without the and. So 5 mils across the whole surface of the system. Well, okay, of course now the and comes back to me. And on those instances where we do see lots of sediment in coarse sediment forebays, my belief is that it's all stuff that's come down from house building sites. I don't go out and find older systems with established catchments that are receiving huge sediment loads. So then the question should be, okay, we've got 5 mils a year ending up on the bioretention surface. 5 mils doesn't sound like much, but does it actually matter? You know, 5 years a year for 10 years is of course 50 mils. It's 5 centimeters. Yeah, that's a little bit more significant. What you know, what does that mean for the system? Well, a while ago, I did a little bit of music modeling, and I'm not the world's biggest fanboy of the model for urban stormwater improvement conceptualization, but I did some modeling where I was like, okay, most bioretention systems we're seeing built in southeast Queensland, the extended detention depth, so the depth from or the height from the surface of the filter media up to the crest of the overflow pit, so the height within which stormwater can pond on the surface before it starts overflowing out of the system, is normally 300 mils. And so I was like, okay, the conceptual problem, if coarse sediment doesn't stop the system draining, and it's only 5 mils a year, so it's not going to be enough to smother a mature plant, although it could, maybe, probably not, but let's conservatively say maybe be a problem for a young plant. Coarse sediment, 5 mils a year, isn't going to smother a mature plant, so then the question should be, okay, what happens if over time it builds up and it fills up the extended detention depth? So I did some music modeling. I was like, okay, I'm going to model a system, you know, fairly typical filter size to catchment size, standard 1 hectare catchment, just normalize a whole bunch of things. I'm going to model that 300 mils extended detention, figure out how much pollution it removes. Then I'm going to model it with slightly less extended detention, as if the filter media, as if the coarse sediment had been spread across the surface of the system and slightly reduced the extended detention depth. So it stored a little bit less water in every storm event and therefore treated a little bit less water. I'm going to model that, see what that means. And then I'm going to model a little bit less extended detention, a little bit less. And then I'm going to aggregate all of this over the period. So if it's 5 mils a year and 300 mils, that's 60 years to fill up. I'm going to aggregate all of this over 60 years and figure out how much pollution, say we had a coarse sediment forebay and we maintained it perfectly to keep all that sediment out, so the extended detention depth never reduced over time. I'm going to figure out how much pollution that system would remove. Then I'm going to take all these separate models that I just ran, gradually reducing the extended detention depth, and I'm going to figure out how much pollution music says those systems will have removed. I'm going to compare them. And I did. And what I found was that the system, which gradually filled up with sediment over time, let's spin this around. The system that gradually filled up with sediment over time removed roughly 30% less pollution over its lifespan than did the system that retained its extended detention depth. Here's the catch though. I also then did some costings for this and looked at the cost to maintain the coarse sediment forebay versus the cost to, the cost to maintain a system that had a coarse sediment forebay and we were maintaining it and the rest of the system, compared to a system without a coarse sediment forebay where we just maintained the system itself. And guess what? The system without the coarse sediment forebay in these particular calcs came out about 30% cheaper. So we lost 30% performance, but we saved 30% of the cost as well. Then really that was only maintenance cost and not capital cost. So some other factors to kind of play around with there. But it got me kind of thinking, I was like, okay, this isn't like, if it had been a case of, oh, you know, we lost 80% of the performance and we saved 20% cost, I'd be a bit like, yep, maybe the sediment forebay's worth it. But when we lost 30% of each over the lifespan and we didn't have a giant concrete area like this that's ugly, we didn't have these weird interfaces where this thing's like cracking up around here, you know, I can't help but thinking that we're better off without them. I just don't get it. Because here's the other thing. I mean, although I didn't factor capital costs in, when you look at the size of this coarse sediment forebay relative to the size of bioretention area over there, right? This coarse sediment forebay conservatively is 25% of the filter media area. It might even be as high as 1/3 of the filter media area. I'm just visually trying to spin that around. Let's try and give you a good shot of that. So in terms of space, particularly if, you know, maybe this is flood prone land here, maybe this doesn't take away from the overall developable land of the catchment, but if you've got a bioretention system that's being built on developable land and you've got forebays taking up like even 10%, like even making the system 10% bigger with a forebay is a fair whack of land cost. Added into that all this concrete, construction costs, what's the word I want to say, the embodied energy, this massive concrete access ramp, because here's the thing, that access ramp wouldn't need to be concrete if you didn't think you were going to be getting a digger down into this forebay, could be crushed rock or something like that. The locking rail, there's just a whole bunch of money being spent in this forebay. So I just can't see the point. So let's recap. Spin this around, let's recap. Did I just, sorry about that. I thought for a second that I had bumped the stop button on the camera. So let's spin it, let's recap. Coarse sediment forebays, they're put in because originally, back in the day, we had some concerns, or when people wrote the Worcester TDG, there were concerns that sediment entering bioretention might be a maintenance problem. So we asked maintenance staff how they'd like to remove it. They quite understandably said they'd like coarse sediment forebays like this, dedicated spot to do it. They didn't necessarily say it had to be concrete like this, but this is what we've ended up with. But when we actually look at it, what we find is we've got two types of sediment. We have coarse sediment and we have suspended sediment coming in. The coarse stuff won't block up the system. The fine stuff will, but the coarse sediment forebay won't do anything for it. The coarse stuff according to the loading rates and the bioretention technical design guidelines, there's not actually that much of it that comes off a developed catchment. And when we do see lots in coarse sediment forebays, it's normally coming off developing catchments with house building sites. It's really all adding up towards one thing for me, which is why the heck are we putting in these coarse sediment forebays? Well, the obvious answer, right, is because for me anyway, they're great to ride a bike on. And that is the only reason, in my opinion, that these coarse sediment forebays are worth it. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, if you have an opinion, actually, so I know that there's people out there who don't agree with my opinion on this. That's cool. If you're in that camp and you want to have a conversation about this, hit me up. I am super keen to do another episode on this. We'll film it. We can have a chat about it, because it's through those discussions that we evolve as an industry. If we just keep putting stuff in and don't question it, one way or the other, bad stuff will happen. But if we talk about it, if we question it, and even if we end up sticking with it, you know, someone comes along and convinces me that I'm not right about this, that's cool. But we have to have the discussion to know that we've made the right decision. And at the moment, I think we're just putting this stuff in willy-nilly without really asking why. Okay, if you want to find more Ideanthro, there's a few ways you can do it. You can find us online at www.ideanthro.com. You can find us on facebook.com/Ideanthro, and you can find us on I do this every episode. Instatube and Ugram. Instagram and YouTube. Sweet, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And one last thought. Apologies that the whole end of that was out of focus. I did in fact tap the camera.